Ha 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 ha. You may be the richest among us, Alexander, but what good is all that money when no woman will ever want to marry you and start a family? Not even your billions can help you with that. Ha 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 ha. The laughter of Victoria Pemberton, old money, older grudges, echoed through the crystal chandeliers of the Metropolitan Club like the cackle of a well-dressed vulture. Her perfectly veneered smile gleamed as she delivered the killing blow to Alexander Blackwood III's pride, her voice carrying just loud enough for Seattle's entire elite to hear over the gentle clink of champagne flutes and Brahms' quartet. Alexander's jaw clenched so hard he thought his molars might crack, the taste of expensive whiskey turning bitter on his tongue. Around him, the city's most powerful families, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the tech moguls who'd bought their way into old society, pretended to study their drinks while hanging on every humiliating word. After all, Victoria continued, her diamond-encrusted fingers adjusting her pearl necklace with theatrical precision. What woman would want to wake up next to that cold, calculating heart of yours every morning? Money can buy you companies, darling, but it can't buy you love. And at 32, well, tick-tock, tick-tock. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander could feel 40 pairs of eyes dissecting him like specimens under a microscope, their whispered conversations from years past echoing in his mind. He's brilliant, but ruthless. Destroys everything he touches. His own parents couldn't stand him. No wonder he's alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, his voice carrying the dangerous quiet of a man pushed to his breaking point. "If you'll excuse me, I have an empire to run." He strode through the marble corridors of the club with military precision, his Armani suit cutting through the air like a blade. But Victoria's cruel laughter followed him, her prophecy echoing in his ears. "No woman will ever want to marry you." 20 minutes later, Alexander sat behind his mahogany desk on the 32nd floor of Blackwood Industries, staring at a job application that might as well have been written in crayon. The morning had started with Victoria's public execution of his personal life, and now his assistant had scheduled him to interview candidates for a janitorial position. Apparently, she'd misunderstood his request to handle the cleaning service situation personally. The elevator chimed, and Elena Vasquez walked into his office like a lamb to the slaughter. She was ordinary, devastatingly, beautifully ordinary, in a way that made his chest tighten with something he didn't recognize. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing the graceful curve of her neck. Her brown eyes sparkled with hope and determination, and her smile, God, her smile could have powered half of Seattle. She wore a navy blazer that had seen better decades, paired with a white blouse that was pressed within an inch of its life, and black pants that were too short by an inch. Her shoes were practical, scuffed, and probably cost less than his morning coffee. But she carried herself with a dignity that made every socialite he'd ever met look like a cheap imitation. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice was warm honey with a slight tremor of nervousness. "I'm Elena Vasquez. Thank you so much for this opportunity." Alexander looked at her application again, Victoria's laughter still ringing in his ears. High school dropout, GED at 22, currently cleaning offices for Sunshine Cleaning Services. No college, no connections, no trust fund. Perfect. "Miss Vasquez," he said, deliberately keeping his voice ice cold as he leaned back in his chair. "Let me ask you something. Do you see this building, this office? The view of Elliott Bay that costs more per square foot than most people make in a year?" Elena's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Yes, sir, it's beautiful. It represents excellence, standards, a level of sophistication that I've spent my entire life building." He stood, moving to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Now look at yourself. Really look. What do you see?" The color drained from Elena's face, but her chin lifted slightly. "I see someone who works hard, sir. I see someone who thinks showing up with a GED and good intentions qualifies her to work in my building." Alexander turned, his gray eyes cutting through her like surgical steel. "Miss Vasquez, you're not just unqualified for this position. You're unqualified to breathe the same air as my employees." Elena flinched as if he'd struck her. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her worn purse, and Alexander could see her fighting back tears. "I see someone," he continued ruthlessly, "who will spend her entire life cleaning up other people's messes because she lacks the intelligence, the education, and the basic social skills to do anything else. You're 26 years old, Miss Vasquez. If you haven't figured out how to better yourself by now, what makes you think you ever will?" The words were poison, each one designed to destroy. Elena's breath came in short gasps, and a single tear escaped down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. I'm sorry for wasting your time, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Wait." The word cracked like a whip across the room. Elena froze with her hand on the door handle, her shoulders shaking. Alexander studied her for a long moment, taking in her proud posture despite his deliberate cruelty, the way she'd lifted her chin even as he'd systematically demolished her self-worth. Victoria's mocking laughter echoed in his mind, and suddenly, an idea began to form. Brilliant, desperate, and completely insane. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Vasquez." She turned slowly, wariness replacing the hurt in her dark eyes. "Sir? I'll pay you $100,000 to pretend to be madly in love with me for exactly 1 month. Elena's mouth fell open, her eyes widening in shock. What? Alexander moved to his desk, pulling out his checkbook with deliberate precision. "You heard me correctly. $100,000. Cash. All you have to do is attend social events with me, hold my hand, gaze at me adoringly, and convince Seattle's elite that someone could actually choose to be with me." He looked up, his eyes hard as diamonds. "Think you can manage that, or is acting above your skill level too?" The insult hit its mark. Elena's spine straightened, and fire blazed in her eyes. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would you offer me this after what you just said to me?" "Because," Alexander said, signing his name to a blank check with flourish, "you're exactly what I need. You're nobody. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And most importantly, you're so far beneath my social circle that your very presence will prove that I can make anyone fall in love with me. Even someone from your circumstances." Elena stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly. When she spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. "You think you can humiliate me, tear me apart, and then buy me like a piece of property?" "Yes," Alexander replied without hesitation. "Because despite your wounded pride, Miss Vasquez, we both know you need this money. I can smell the desperation on you. It's in the way you pressed that ancient blazer, the way you practiced your answers in the mirror this morning, the way you're fighting not to look at this check." He was right, and they both knew it. Elena's eyes flickered to the check despite herself, and Alexander saw the exact moment her resolve began to crack. "Your mother's medical bills," he continued, his voice softening to a dangerous whisper. "Stage 4 lung cancer, isn't it? The experimental treatment she needs costs more than you'll make in 10 years of cleaning toilets." Elena gasped, her face going white. "How did you—" "I know everything about everyone who walks into my building. The question is, are you going to let your pride kill your mother, or are you going to swallow it and save her life?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Elena's hands were shaking now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the check that could save everything she loved. "What exactly would I have to do?" she whispered. Alexander smiled, the first genuine expression he'd shown all day. "Attend my grandmother's birthday party in 3 weeks. She's the only family I have left, and she's dying. She believes I'm going to end up alone and miserable because I'm—" He paused, Victoria's words echoing in his mind. "Because no woman will ever want to marry me and start a family." Elena's eyes widened with understanding. "My grandmother is throwing me a party. All of Seattle's most influential families will be there, including Victoria Pemberton, who made it very clear this morning that I'm destined to die alone." His voice hardened. "I want to walk into that party with you on my arm and watch their faces when they realize that Alexander Blackwood III has found someone who chooses to be with him." "Even if it's all a lie?" Elena asked. especially if it's all a lie. Alexander tore the check from the book and held it out to her. 1 month, Miss Vasquez. 30 days of pretending to adore me. In return, your mother gets the treatment she needs, and I get to prove that even someone like you can fall for someone like me. Elena stared at the check. $100,000 written in Alexander's bold handwriting. She thought of her mother, hooked up to machines they couldn't afford, of the nurses who looked at her with pity when the bills came due, of a lifetime of being told she wasn't good enough, smart enough, worthy enough. If I do this, she said slowly, I have conditions. Alexander raised an eyebrow. You're hardly in a position to negotiate. Maybe not, Elena replied, straightening her shoulders. But if you want me to pretend to love you, you need to understand something, Mr. Blackwood. I may be poor and I may be desperate, but I'm not stupid. And I'm certainly not going to let you treat me like garbage for a month just because you're paying me. For the first time since she'd walked into his office, Alexander looked genuinely surprised. Respect, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. If we're going to do this, you treat me with basic human decency. No more insults about my education or my background, in public and in private. Alexander studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Agreed. Anything else? I want to meet your grandmother first. If I'm going to convince her that I care about you, I need to understand why she's worried. Done. Alexander held out the check again. Do we have a deal, Miss Vasquez? Elena looked at the check, then at Alexander's face, searching for any sign of the man who'd just systematically destroyed her self-esteem. All she saw was cold calculation and desperate determination, and something else, something that looked almost like hope. She took the check. We have a deal, Mr. Blackwood. But understand this, you may have bought my time, but you haven't bought my soul. If you want me to pretend to love you, you're going to have to give me something to work with. Alexander's lips curved in what might have been a smile. Careful, Miss Vasquez. You might find that harder than you think. As Elena walked toward the elevator, the check burning in her hands like fire, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil himself. But as her phone buzzed with another text from the hospital, she knew she'd made the only choice she could. The elevator doors closed between them, but Alexander's words echoed in her mind. You might find that harder than you think. Looking at her reflection in the polished steel doors, Elena whispered, We'll see about that, Mr. Blackwood. We'll see about that. Sweet mother of pearl, what happened to you? Elena's best friend Maria nearly dropped her coffee mug as she stared at the mountain of shopping bags that had just been delivered to Elena's cramped studio apartment. Nordstrom, Neiman Marcus, Tiffany & Co. The logos alone probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. I made a deal with the devil, Elena muttered, pulling a silk dress from one of the bags. The price tag made her stomach lurch. $3,200 for one dress. She could feed herself for 6 months on that much money. Mija, you better start explaining before I call the police, Maria said, her Puerto Rican accent thickening with concern. Because last I heard you were interviewing for a janitor job, not shopping on Rodeo Drive. Elena sank onto her threadbare couch, the weight of what she'd agreed to hitting her like a freight train. Remember Alexander Blackwood? The billionaire who owns half of Seattle? The Ice King? The one they call the Destroyer in the business section? Maria's eyes widened. Elena, please tell me you didn't... I'm going to be his fake girlfriend for a month. The silence that followed was so complete Elena could hear Mrs. Chen's television through the paper-thin walls. Come again? Maria whispered. $100,000, Maria, for 30 days of pretending to be in love with him. Elena's voice broke slightly. Mama's treatment. The experimental therapy. This is the only way. Maria set down her coffee and pulled Elena into a fierce hug. Oh, honey, what did that cabron do to you? Before Elena could answer, her phone rang. Alexander's name flashed on the screen like a summons from Hades himself. Hello? Elena answered, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Vasquez, I trust the wardrobe arrived safely? His voice was crisp, businesslike, as if they were discussing quarterly reports instead of her complete transformation. Mr. Blackwood, this is too much. These clothes cost more than I make in a year. That's precisely the point. If you're going to convince anyone that you're with me, you need to look the part. I won't have my girlfriend appearing in public wearing. What was it you had on yesterday? A blazer from the Clinton administration? Elena's cheeks burned with humiliation, even as Maria made violent hand gestures suggesting various creative ways to harm Alexander's anatomy. I'll have my stylist, Genevieve, arrive at your apartment in an hour, Alexander continued. She'll help you with hair, makeup, and deportment. We have dinner at Le Bernardin tonight, 7 o'clock sharp. Tonight? Elena squeaked. But I thought we had time to prepare. There is no time, Miss Vasquez. Victoria Pemberton's charity luncheon is tomorrow, and I intend to make my first public appearance with you there. Consider tonight your final examination. The line went dead, leaving Elena staring at her phone in disbelief. What did El Diablo want now? Maria demanded. Dinner, tonight, at Le Bernardin. Elena's voice rose to near hysteria. Maria, I don't even know how to pronounce half the things on their menu. Ay, Dios mío. Maria grabbed Elena's shoulders. Listen to me, Prima. You are Elena Vasquez. You survived growing up in Rainier Valley. You've been working 3 jobs to pay for your mama's treatment. And you once told off that pendejo landlord so good he actually fixed the heat. Some rich boy with more money than sense doesn't get to intimidate you. Elena nodded, trying to summon her courage when a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. She opened the door to find a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of Vogue magazine. Platinum blonde hair and a perfect chignon, wearing a cream-colored Chanel suit that probably cost more than Elena's car. Darling, you must be Elena, the woman said in a crisp British accent. I'm Genevieve Ashworth, and I have exactly 67 minutes to perform a miracle. Genevieve swept into the apartment like a well-dressed hurricane, her critical gaze taking in everything from Elena's chipped nail polish to the water stain on the ceiling. Oh my, she murmured, circling Elena like a predator sizing up prey. Alexander certainly enjoys his challenges, doesn't he? Elena's temper flared. Look, lady. It's Genevieve, darling, and sit. She gestured imperiously toward a chair she'd somehow procured from thin air. We haven't time for wounded pride. Your posture is atrocious, your hair is crying for help, and don't get me started on those eyebrows. For the next hour, Elena was prodded, plucked, painted, and polished until she barely recognized herself. Genevieve worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, transforming Elena's wild curls into an elegant updo that somehow made her neck look longer and her cheekbones more pronounced. Now, Genevieve said, pulling out a midnight blue dress that hugged Elena's curves in ways that should probably be illegal. Let's discuss tonight's performance. Performance? Elena asked, stepping into the dress with Genevieve's help. Darling, being with Alexander Blackwood is always a performance. The man hasn't had a genuine emotion since the Clinton administration. The first one. Genevieve zipped up the dress, then stepped back to admire her work. Your job is to make him look human. Laugh at his jokes even though he hasn't made a funny one since prep school. Touch his arm when he speaks. Gaze at him like he hung the moon, even though we both know he'd probably charge admission to see it. Elena stared at herself in the full-length mirror Genevieve had somehow manifested. The woman looking back was beautiful, sophisticated, the kind of woman who belonged in places like Le Bernardin. But here's the real secret, Genevieve continued, applying a final coat of deep red lipstick to Elena's lips. Don't try to be someone else. Alexander chose you for a reason, and I suspect it wasn't just because you're convenient. Before Elena could ask what she meant, Genevieve's phone chimed. That'll be your car, darling. Alexander is waiting downstairs. Elena's stomach dropped. He's here? Now? Punctuality is one of his few virtues. Genevieve gathered her supplies with practiced efficiency. Remember, shoulders back, chin up, and smile like you know a delicious secret. You've got this, darling. Elena grabbed her new purse, a clutch that cost more than her monthly groceries, and headed for the door. Maria caught her arm as she passed. Elena, her friend said softly, don't let him change who you are, okay? You're perfect, just as you are. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice, and made her way downstairs on heels that felt like stilts. The elevator seemed to take forever, and when the doors finally opened to the lobby, she nearly lost her nerve entirely. Alexander stood near the entrance, checking his Rolex with the impatience of a man who owned time itself. He was devastatingly handsome in a black Tom Ford tuxedo that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body. When he looked up and saw her, his expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for Elena to read. "Miss Vasquez," he said, his voice oddly hoarse. "Mr. Blackwood." Elena lifted her chin, channeling every ounce of dignity she possessed. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting." Alexander's eyes traveled slowly from her face to her toes and back again, and Elena felt heat spreading through her body under his scrutiny. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You look acceptable." "Acceptable?" Elena's temper flared, destroying the sophisticated facade in an instant. "I look like $1,000,000 and we both know it." For the first time since she'd met him, Alexander Blackwood smiled. Not the cold, calculating expression she'd grown used to, but a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Yes," he said softly. "You do." The limousine ride to Le Bernardin was a study in awkward silence. Elena perched on the edge of the leather seat, trying not to wrinkle her dress while Alexander stared out the window at the Seattle skyline. The space between them seemed to crackle with electricity. "Tell me about your mother," Alexander said suddenly. Elena started. "What?" "If we're going to convince people we're together, I should know something about your life beyond what's in your employment records." Elena studied his profile looking for signs of mockery, but his expression seemed genuinely curious. "Her name is Carmen," Elena said slowly. "She immigrated from El Salvador when she was 18, worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school. She's the strongest person I know." Elena's voice softened. "She used to sing to me when I was little. Old songs from her village. Even now, when the chemo makes her sick, she tries to hum them." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "She sounds remarkable." "She is." Elena turned to look at him fully. "What about your family? Your grandmother?" Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood, is 92 years old and has more steel in her spine than most men half her age. She raised me after my parents died." "How old were you?" 8. The word came out flat, emotionless. "Car accident. They were coming home from one of their fights. They fought constantly. Maybe if they'd been paying attention to the road instead of screaming at each other." Elena felt her heart clench. "Alexander, I'm so sorry." He looked at her sharply, as if surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it hurt less." The limousine pulled up to Le Bernardin, and Elena felt her nerves spike again. Through the windows, she could see other couples entering the restaurant, women dripping in diamonds, men who looked like they'd been born wearing tuxedos. "I can't do this," Elena whispered, panic rising in her throat. "Alexander, they're going to take one look at me and know I don't belong here." Alexander turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. "Listen to me, Elena. You're about to walk into that restaurant as my girlfriend. That means you belong anywhere I belong. Don't you dare let anyone make you feel otherwise." The way he said her name, Elena, not Miss Vasquez, made something flutter in her chest. "But what if I use the wrong fork? What if I can't pronounce something on the menu? What if—" "Then you ask questions. You admit you don't know something. The only truly unforgivable sin in society is pretending to be something you're not." Alexander's voice grew softer. "Be yourself, Elena. That's what I'm paying you for." The car door opened and Alexander stepped out, extending his hand to help her from the limousine. Elena took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of strength her mother had ever shown her, and placed her hand in his. The moment their fingers touched, electricity shot up her arm like lightning. Alexander's grip tightened slightly, and when she looked up at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Ready?" he asked. Elena straightened her shoulders and smiled, not the practiced smile Genevieve had taught her, but her own bright, genuine expression. "Ready," she said. As they walked toward the restaurant entrance, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to step through a doorway into an entirely different life. Behind them, the limousine pulled away, cutting off her last chance of escape. But as Alexander's hand settled on the small of her back, guiding her toward their fate, Elena realized something that terrified her more than any fancy restaurant or judgmental socialite. She was starting to look forward to finding out what came next. The maitre d' greeted them with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty, and as they were led to their table, Elena caught sight of herself in the restaurant's mirrors. The woman staring back looked confident, sophisticated, beautiful. The woman staring back looked like she belonged on Alexander Blackwood's arm, and that, Elena realized with growing alarm, might be the most dangerous transformation of all. Well, 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 Alexander Blackwood has brought a date. How quaint. Victoria Pemberton's voice dripped with venomous honey as she glided across the marble floor of the Four Seasons Olympic Hotel ballroom, her emerald Valentino gown trailing behind her like a serpent's tail. The charity luncheon for underprivileged youth was in full swing, though Elena suspected most of these people had never met an underprivileged youth in their diamond-encrusted lives. Elena felt Alexander's arm tense beneath her fingers as Victoria approached, her predatory smile gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. Around them, Seattle's elite turned like vultures sensing fresh carrion, their conversations dying to whispers as they prepared for the show. "Victoria," Alexander replied coolly, his voice carrying the temperature of liquid nitrogen. "How charitable of you to actually attend your own fundraiser. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten it wasn't just an excuse to show off your new jewelry." Victoria's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Oh, darling, you haven't lost your charming wit. But you've gained something far more interesting." Her calculating blue eyes swept over Elena like a scanner pricing merchandise. "And who might this lovely creature be?" Elena felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes dissecting her Hermès dress, her Louboutin heels, her carefully styled hair. She could practically hear their mental calculators working. Too pretty to be hired help, too polished to be new money, too unknown to be old money. "Victoria Pemberton," Alexander said, his hand moving possessively to Elena's waist. "I'd like you to meet Elena Vasquez, my girlfriend." The word hung in the perfumed air like a challenge thrown down in medieval court. Elena felt her stomach flip, but she forced herself to smile with the same confidence she'd used to face down collection agencies and hostile landlords. "Mrs. Pemberton," Elena said, extending her hand with practiced grace. "What a pleasure to meet you. Alexander has told me so much about your friendship." Victoria's handshake was limp and cold, like touching a dead fish. "Has he now? How fascinating. I don't believe I've seen you at any of our usual gatherings, Miss Vasquez," Elena replied smoothly, refusing to be intimidated by the obvious fishing expedition. "And you're right. This is all quite new to me. Alexander has been wonderfully patient in showing me his world." "His world," Victoria repeated, her smile sharpening to a blade's edge. "How delightfully aspirational of you." Elena felt the insult hit like a slap, but before she could respond, Alexander's voice cut through the tension like a sword. "Actually, Victoria, Elena has been showing me a few things about her world as well. It's amazing what you can learn when you step outside your bubble." His gray eyes glittered dangerously. "Though I suppose that's not something you'd understand." The surrounding crowd drew closer, sensing blood in the water. Elena could see phones being discreetly raised, social media posts being crafted in real time. By tomorrow, this conversation would be dissected across every gossip blog and society column in the Pacific Northwest. "How romantic," Victoria purred. But her eyes remained cold as Arctic ice. "Tell me, Miss Vasquez, what do you do? Besides dating billionaires, of course." The question was designed to destroy. Elena could feel the trap closing around her. Admit to her humble job and be dismissed as a gold digger. Lie and risk being exposed later. She looked at Alexander, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm in the service industry," Elena said finally, lifting her chin with defiant pride. I help people maintain the spaces where they work and live. It's honest work, and I'm proud of it. A murmur ran through the crowd like electricity. Someone, Elena thought it might be Constance Whitmore, actually gasped. Victoria's smile turned triumphant. How refreshing, Victoria said, the word dripping with condescension. A working girl. How very pretty woman of you, Alexander. Though I do hope you've learned from Richard Gere's mistakes and aren't planning anything too permanent. The comment hit its mark perfectly. Elena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as laughter rippled through the gathering. She was 8 years old again, standing in the school cafeteria while the rich kids mocked her free lunch tickets. But then Alexander's hand tightened on her waist, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who could buy and sell everyone in the room. Victoria, he said, his tone so cold it could have frozen champagne. I find it interesting that someone who inherited her wealth through 3 marriages to increasingly older men would question anyone else's motivations. The crowd fell silent. Victoria's face went white, then red, as if she'd been slapped. Furthermore, Alexander continued, his voice rising just enough to carry to the far corners of the ballroom. Elena has something that all the money in this room can't buy: integrity. She works for everything she has, she takes care of her family, and she doesn't need to tear others down to feel important. His eyes swept the crowd with withering contempt. How many people in this room can say the same? Elena stared at Alexander in shock. He was defending her, not just politely deflecting Victoria's attacks, but actively championing her worth. Something warm and dangerous bloomed in her chest. Victoria's composure cracked like thin ice. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Alexander's smile was razor sharp. Elena, darling, would you like to dance? I think the air in here has become rather toxic. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. As Alexander led her toward the dance floor, she could hear the crowd erupting into furious whispers behind them. Victoria's voice rose above the din, shrill with rage. This isn't over, Alexander. You can dress her up, but we all know what she really is. Alexander stopped so abruptly that Elena nearly stumbled. When he turned back to face Victoria, his expression was terrifying in its controlled fury. What she really is, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom, is the best thing that's ever happened to me. And if you or anyone else in this room has a problem with that, you're welcome to take it up with my legal team. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could feel her heart pounding against her ribs as Alexander turned back to her, his expression softening instantly. Shall we? He asked, offering his arm. Elena took it, her legs trembling slightly as they walked onto the marble dance floor. The orchestra began a slow waltz, and Alexander pulled her into his arms with the fluid grace of someone born to wealth and privilege. I'm sorry, he murmured, as they began to move, his breath warm against her ear. I should have prepared you better for Victoria. She's unpleasant on the best of days. Unpleasant? Elena looked up at him, still reeling from his defense of her. Alexander, she practically called me a prostitute in front of half of Seattle. Yes, well, Victoria has always been threatened by anyone with actual substance. Alexander's hand pressed against her lower back, guiding her through the steps. Are you all right? Elena studied his face, searching for the cold, calculating man who had humiliated her in his office just 2 days ago. This Alexander, the one who had publicly defended her honor, who was looking at her with genuine concern, was someone entirely different. Why did you do that? She asked softly. Do what? Defend me. Stand up to her. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You could have just let her have her fun and moved on. It would have been easier. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Because, he said finally, what she said about you was wrong. And He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I don't like seeing you hurt. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Elena felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. This was supposed to be pretend, a business transaction, nothing more. But the way Alexander was looking at her, the way his thumb was tracing small circles on her back as they danced, felt dangerously real. "Alexander," she began, but he shook his head. "Don't," he said quietly. "Whatever you're about to say, don't. Just let me have this moment." Elena nodded, her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. They danced in silence, surrounded by whispers and stares, lost in a bubble that seemed to exist outside of time and space. When the song ended, Alexander didn't immediately release her. They stood there, swaying slightly, his arms around her waist, her hands on his shoulders. Elena could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her want to bury her face in his neck. "Elena," he whispered, and she could see something vulnerable and desperate in his eyes. Alexander, there you are." The spell was broken by a warm, cultured voice. Elena turned to see an elegant elderly woman approaching them, leaning lightly on a silver-headed cane. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but she carried herself with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her silver hair was styled in a perfect chignon, and her navy dress was clearly couture, but it was her eyes that caught Elena's attention. They were the same storm gray as Alexander's, but where his were often cold and guarded, hers sparkled with warmth and mischief. "Grandmother," Alexander said, his entire demeanor shifting. The vulnerable man from moments before disappeared, replaced by dutiful grandson. "I didn't know you were coming today." "Nonsense," the woman replied, waving her cane dismissively. "Victoria Pemberton's charity luncheons are the best entertainment in Seattle. All that barely concealed venom disguised as philanthropy. It's better than television." Her shrewd gaze landed on Elena. "And this must be the young woman who has Seattle society in such an uproar." Elena felt her stomach drop. "Mrs. Blackwood, Oh, darling, call me Eleanor. And don't look so terrified. I don't bite. Much." Eleanor's smile was warm but assessing. "Alexander, be a dear and get me some champagne. The good stuff, not whatever swill Victoria is serving the masses. I'd like to chat with Elena alone." Alexander looked like he was about to refuse, but one sharp look from his grandmother had him nodding reluctantly. "I'll be right back," he told Elena, squeezing her hand. The moment he was gone, Eleanor turned her full attention to Elena, and suddenly, Elena understood where Alexander had learned his intimidating stare. "So," Eleanor said, her voice deceptively casual, "you're the one who has my grandson tied up in knots." Elena's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry?" "Oh, please, dear. I've been watching Alexander navigate social situations since he was 8 years old. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he was looking at you just now." Eleanor's eyes twinkled with amusement. "The question is, are you playing a game, or is this real?" Elena felt like a deer caught in headlights. This tiny woman was dissecting her with the precision of a surgeon, and Elena had the distinct feeling that lying would be both impossible and incredibly unwise. Elena began, then stopped. How could she explain that what had started as a business transaction was becoming something she couldn't identify? That every time Alexander touched her, her carefully built walls cracked a little more. "It's complicated," she said finally. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Simple answers are for simple people, and you, my dear, are clearly anything but simple." She studied Elena for another long moment. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at my grandson?" Elena glanced toward the bar where Alexander was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with the bartender about champagne vintages. "I see." Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "I see someone who's forgotten how to let people close. Someone who's built walls so high he can't see over them anymore." She looked back at Eleanor. "But sometimes, when he thinks no one is looking, I see the boy he used to be. Before he had to become so hard." Eleanor's expression softened, and for the first time, Elena saw genuine emotion in those sharp gray eyes. Alexander's parents died when he was very young, Eleanor said quietly. Before that, they fought constantly. Terrible, vicious arguments that terrified him. After they died, he decided that caring too much was dangerous, that love was a weakness that got people hurt. Elena felt her heart clench. Mrs. Blackwood. Eleanor, the older woman corrected automatically. I've spent 24 years trying to convince him otherwise, but watching him with you today, I think he might finally be ready to listen. Before Elena could respond, Alexander returned with 3 glasses of champagne balanced expertly in his hands. What are you two conspiring about? He asked, handing each woman a glass. Oh, just girl talk, darling, Eleanor replied innocently. Elena was telling me about her mother. Carmen, isn't it? She sounds like a remarkable woman. Elena shot a surprised look at Alexander. When had she told him her mother's name? She is, Elena said softly. She's been my hero my whole life. Heroes are important, Eleanor said, raising her glass. They remind us what we're capable of becoming. She looked pointedly at Alexander. Shall we toast? To new beginnings and second chances. They raised their glasses, and as Elena sipped the champagne, which probably cost more than her monthly salary, she caught Alexander watching her over the rim of his glass. There was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken, something that looked dangerously like hope. From across the ballroom, Victoria Pemberton's voice carried over the gentle murmur of conversation. Mark my words, this little romance won't last the month. Men like Alexander Blackwood don't marry the help. Eleanor's jaw tightened and she set down her champagne with deliberate precision. Excuse me, dears. I believe it's time someone reminded Victoria Pemberton that nouveau riche is still just rich with delusions of grandeur. As Eleanor marched toward Victoria with the determination of a general heading into battle, Elena couldn't help but smile. Your grandmother is terrifying, she told Alexander. You have no idea, he replied, but his tone was fond. She likes you. How can you tell? She hasn't had you investigated yet. Alexander's smile was wry. Give her another day or two. Elena laughed despite herself, and the sound seemed to surprise them both. For a moment, the pretense fell away, and they were just a man and woman sharing a genuine moment of humor. Elena, Alexander said, his voice suddenly serious. About what happened with Victoria. Thank you, Elena interrupted, for standing up for me. You didn't have to do that. Yes, Alexander said quietly. I did. Their eyes met and held, and Elena felt something shift between them, something that had nothing to do with contracts or money or elaborate charades. Something real and terrifying, and absolutely impossible to ignore. Across the ballroom, Eleanor Blackwood was making Victoria Pemberton look like a scolded child, and the assembled crowd was hanging on every word. But Elena barely noticed. All she could see was Alexander, looking at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. And God help her. She was starting to think he might be right. My parents died in this room. Elena froze in the doorway of Alexander's childhood bedroom, her breath catching at the raw pain in his voice. They'd come to the Blackwood estate so she could meet Eleanor properly before the upcoming birthday party. But Alexander had insisted on showing her the house first. All 47 rooms of Gothic grandeur that felt more like a museum than a home. Alexander, she whispered, but he was staring at the mahogany 4-poster bed where he'd hidden as an 8-year-old boy, listening to his parents scream at each other through these very walls. They were fighting about me, actually, he continued, his voice hollow. Father wanted to send me to boarding school in Switzerland. Mother said it was too far. They fought for hours. He moved to the window that overlooked the circular driveway. When they finally left to go to dinner, I remember thinking how quiet the house felt. I didn't know it would stay that way forever. Elena's heart shattered. This wasn't the cold, calculating billionaire who'd humiliated her in his office. This was a broken man showing her his deepest wounds. The irony is, Alexander said with a bitter laugh, I ended up in Switzerland anyway. Eleanor couldn't handle an 8-year-old and an empire, so off I went. 6 years of learning how to be perfect, how to never show weakness, how to win at everything except what matters. Elena stepped closer, her heels silent on the Persian rug. You came back, though. When I was 14. But by then, I was already... He gestured vaguely at himself. This. Eleanor tried to fix me, but the damage was done. I was too much like my father. Cold, driven, incapable of real connection. That's not true, Elena said fiercely. Alexander, what you did today at the luncheon was for show. His laugh was sharp, self-deprecating. Everything I do is for show, Elena. Even this. He gestured between them. Especially this. The words hit like a physical blow. Elena felt something precious and fragile crack inside her chest. For the past 3 days, she'd begun to believe that what was happening between them was real. That beneath his polished exterior, Alexander Blackwood might actually care about her. Of course, she said quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. How could I forget? This is all just business. Alexander turned from the window and Elena was shocked to see something like panic in his gray eyes. Elena, I didn't mean... No, you're right. Elena backed toward the door, needing distance before she did something humiliating like cry. Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Blackwood. I'll try to remember my place. Don't do that, Alexander said sharply, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. Don't call me that. Don't retreat behind walls. Why not? Elena's voice rose, all her carefully controlled emotions spilling out. You do it every time things get real between us. Every time I start to think there might be something more than a contract here, you remind me that I'm just the hired help. Because I don't know how to do this. Alexander exploded, his careful composure finally cracking. I don't know how to be with someone without destroying them. Everyone I've ever cared about either leaves or dies, and I won't. His voice broke. I won't do that to you. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Elena could see the little boy he'd been, terrified and alone in this room, learning that love meant pain and loss. So you push me away first, she said softly, before I can leave on my own. Alexander's nod was barely perceptible. It's easier. Easier for who? Elena took a step closer, her heart pounding. Alexander, I'm not your parents. I'm not going anywhere. You say that now. I say it because I mean it. Elena reached up and cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. You want to know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who's spent so long protecting himself that he's forgotten he's worth protecting. I see someone who's convinced himself he's unlovable because it's safer than risking his heart. Alexander's breath hitched. Elena, I see someone I could fall in love with, she whispered. If he'd let me. The confession hung in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Elena saw the exact moment Alexander's walls crumbled, saw the vulnerable man beneath all that wealth and armor. You don't know what you're saying, he breathed, but his hands came up to cover hers, holding them against his face like a lifeline. Don't I? Elena smiled through the tears she didn't realize had started falling. Alexander, in 3 days you've shown me more kindness, more passion, more real emotion than most people manage in a lifetime. You defended me against Victoria. You stood up for my worth when no one else would. You make me feel like I matter. You do matter, Alexander said fiercely. Elena, you matter more than... The sound of heels clicking on marble interrupted them. Eleanor's voice drifted up from the foyer below. Alexander, Elena, are you ready for tea, dears? Alexander closed his eyes, his forehead dropping to rest against Elena's. We should go. Should we? Elena's voice was barely a whisper. Or should we finish this conversation? Elena, Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and his entire demeanor shifted, becoming cold and distant once again. I have to take this. Elena watched in dismay as the vulnerable man disappeared, replaced by the CEO who trusted no one and needed nothing. Of course you do, she said quietly, stepping back. Alexander answered the phone with crisp efficiency. Blackwood, what do you mean the Henderson deal fell through? I specifically said. His voice faded as he walked toward his study, leaving Elena alone in the room where his childhood had died. 20 minutes later, Elena sat in Eleanor's rose garden, balancing a delicate china teacup and trying to pretend her heart wasn't breaking. He does that, you know, Eleanor said conversationally, as if reading her thoughts. Runs away whenever things get too real. Elena nearly choked on her tea. I'm sorry? My grandson. He gets close to something meaningful, then finds an excuse to retreat. Eleanor's eyes twinkled with mischief. That phone call, for instance, could have waited until tomorrow, but Alexander has been hiding behind work for so long it's become instinct. Mrs. Blackwood. Eleanor. And before you tell me it's complicated, dear, I already know. The older woman leaned forward conspiratorially. The question is, are you going to let him get away with it? Elena stared at her. What do you mean? Alexander has been running from love his entire life. First his parents, then a series of perfectly suitable women who never challenged him to be better. Eleanor's gaze was shrewd. But you, my dear, you're different. You see through his armor to the man underneath. The question is, are you brave enough to fight for him? Before Elena could answer, Alexander appeared on the garden path, his expression carefully neutral. Elena, I apologize, but something urgent has come up at the office. We'll need to cut this short. Of course, Elena said, setting down her teacup with forced calm. Business first. Alexander flinched at her tone, but Eleanor simply smiled. Nonsense, the older woman said firmly. Elena will stay for dinner. My driver can take her home afterward. She looked at her grandson with disappointment. Some things, Alexander, are more important than work. Alexander's jaw tightened. Grandmother. Go, Elena said quietly. Run back to your safe little office where emotions can't touch you. But don't expect me to keep pretending this is just business when we both know it stopped being that the moment you defended me to Victoria. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, something like longing flickering in his gray eyes. Then the mask slammed back into place. I'll pick you up tomorrow at 7 for the pre-party dinner, he said formally. Wear the black dress. Which black dress? Elena asked with false sweetness. The one that makes you look like you belong with me? Alexander replied, then turned and walked away, leaving Elena staring after him with her heart in pieces. Eleanor patted her hand gently. Give him time, dear. Some walls take longer to tear down than others. Elena nodded, but as she watched Alexander's car disappear down the long driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a war she'd already lost. Tomorrow was the birthday party. Tomorrow she'd have to stand beside him and pretend to be in love while her actual feelings tore her apart from the inside. Tomorrow, Elena Vasquez would discover whether she was strong enough to love a man who was determined to break both their hearts. The contract is terminated, Miss Vasquez, effective immediately. Elena stared at the certified check Alexander's lawyer had just handed her, the full $100,000 plus an additional $50,000 for services rendered. The words on the accompanying legal document blurred as her eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. But the party is tonight, she whispered, looking up at Alexander, who stood behind his desk like a statue carved from ice. Your grandmother will have to accept that some fairy tales don't have happy endings. Alexander's voice was flat, emotionless, the warmth she'd glimpsed yesterday completely erased. Thank you for your, assistance. Please keep the wardrobe as compensation for any inconvenience. Elena felt like she was drowning. 24 hours ago, she'd confessed her feelings to this man. She'd seen him vulnerable and broken, had held his face in her hands and promised she wasn't going anywhere. Now he was dismissing her like a business transaction that had outlived its usefulness. What happened? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander, Yesterday I made a mistake. He turned to face the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that screamed control and distance. I allowed myself to forget that this was a business arrangement. It won't happen again. You're lying, Elena stood, her legs trembling with fury and heartbreak. You're scared, so you're running, just like you always do. Alexander's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. I'm protecting us both from an inevitable disappointment. By breaking my heart? Elena's voice cracked. By throwing away something that could have been beautiful? There was nothing beautiful about it, Alexander said coldly. It was an illusion, Elena. A fantasy. I'm a billionaire. You clean offices. That's reality. The words hit like physical blows. Elena could feel herself fragmenting, the confident woman she'd become over the past week crumbling back into the insecure girl who'd always been told she wasn't good enough. You're right, she said quietly, picking up the check with hands that barely shook. I forgot my place. Thank you for the reminder, Mr. Blackwood. She turned toward the door, her dignity hanging by a thread, when Alexander's voice stopped her. Elena, His voice broke slightly, and when she looked back she saw anguish flash across his features before the mask slammed back into place. I'm sorry. For everything. Elena nodded once, not trusting her voice, and walked out of Alexander Blackwood's life forever. 3 hours later, Elena sat in her mother's hospital room, holding Carmen's frail hand while machines beeped steadily around them. The experimental treatment had been approved. The money would save her mother's life. But the cost had been higher than Elena could have imagined. Mija, Carmen whispered, her voice weak but her eyes alert. Why do you look like someone died? Elena forced a smile. Just tired, Mama. But I have good news. The treatment is paid for. You're going to get better. Carmen's eyes sharpened. The janitor job paid that much? Elena couldn't meet her mother's gaze. I found another way. Elena Maria Vasquez, Carmen said in the tone that had terrified Elena since childhood. What did you do? Before Elena could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Turn on Channel 7 News. Now. Elena fumbled for the remote, switching the small television to the local news. Her blood turned to ice as she saw footage of Alexander arriving at his grandmother's birthday party, alone, while the reporter's voice filled the room. Billionaire Alexander Blackwood III arrived solo tonight at his grandmother's 93rd birthday celebration, despite reports of a new romance that had Seattle society buzzing. Sources close to the family say the relationship ended abruptly this afternoon, with some suggesting the mystery woman was paid to attend public events. Elena felt the room spinning. On screen, Alexander looked devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, but his expression was carved from granite. The reporter continued, This reporter has learned that the woman, identified as Elena Vasquez, is employed by a local cleaning service. The nature of their arrangement remains unclear, but one source described it as Pretty Woman Meets Reality TV. Elena grabbed the remote and turned off the television, her cheeks burning with humiliation. Carmen was staring at her with a mixture of understanding and disappointment. You sold yourself, her mother said quietly. No, Mama, it wasn't like that. You sold yourself to save me. Carmen's eyes filled with tears. Mija, what have you done? Elena broke down then, the whole story pouring out between sobs, the fake relationship, the money, the way she'd started to fall for Alexander despite herself, and his brutal dismissal that morning. Carmen listened in silence, then pulled Elena into her arms with what little strength she had. Mi amor, she whispered, money that costs your soul is no money at all. But you'll live, Elena sobbed. That's all that matters. No, Carmen said firmly. What matters is that you remember who you are. You are Elena Vasquez. You bow to no one, you apologize for nothing, and you never let anyone make you feel small. Her voice grew stronger. That man may have money, but you have something he lost long ago. Courage. Elena pulled back, wiping her eyes. Mama. Go, Carmen said. Go to that party. What? No, I can't. You can, and you will. Carmen's eyes blazed with the fire that had carried her across borders and through decades of struggle. You go to that party. You hold your head high and you show them all what Elena Vasquez is made of. But I don't have an invitation anymore. Security won't let me in. Carmen smiled, the expression transforming her thin face. Mija, when has a little thing like permission ever stopped us? The Blackwood estate blazed with light as Elena approached on foot, having taken 3 buses and walked the final mile in her highest heels. She'd chosen her armor carefully. The midnight blue dress from their first dinner, her hair swept up in an elegant chignon, and her mother's pearl earrings for strength. Through the massive windows, she could see Seattle's elite in all their glittering glory. The party was in full swing, but even from the outside, Elena could sense something was wrong. The energy felt flat, performative. She made her way around to the service entrance, where catering staff were rushing in and out. Her years of working in buildings like this had taught her that if you moved with purpose and confidence, people assumed you belonged. "Excuse me," she said to a harried server. "Mrs. Blackwood asked me to check on the champagne service. Are we running low?" The server barely glanced at her elegant dress. "Kitchen's through there, but she's not happy about something. Been asking for her grandson all night." Elena nodded and slipped inside, her heart pounding as she navigated the maze of corridors toward the ballroom. She could hear Eleanor's voice rising above the crowd. "Absolutely ridiculous. Alexander, where is that lovely girl? Elena, what's her name?" Elena paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. Alexander stood near the far wall, surrounded by the usual suspects, Victoria Pemberton prominent among them, but he looked like a man attending his own funeral. Eleanor was in the center of the room, magnificent in silver silk, demanding answers with the authority of a queen. "Grandmother?" Alexander said wearily. "I told you it didn't work out." "Nonsense," Eleanor snapped. That girl had more spirit in her little finger than all these vapid creatures combined. "What did you do?" Victoria stepped forward with predatory glee. "Oh, Eleanor, surely you didn't think that little arrangement was real? Alexander paid her to be here. It was all just a business transaction." The crowd gasped and tittered, and Elena saw Alexander's jaw clench, but he didn't deny it. Eleanor's face went white, then red. "Alexander James Blackwood, tell me she's lying." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes scanning the crowd of vultures waiting for his response. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the silent ballroom. "No," he said quietly. "She's not lying." The confession hit like a bomb. Eleanor's face crumpled and Elena felt her own heart shatter all over again. But then Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger. "I did pay Elena to be my girlfriend. $100,000 for 1 month of her time." The crowd murmured with shocked delight, but Alexander wasn't finished. "It was the best money I ever spent because it gave me 4 days with the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." Elena's breath caught. Around the ballroom, the whispers died away. "Elena Vasquez is brave, intelligent, compassionate, and real in a way that none of us." Alexander's eyes swept the crowd with disgust. "Have been in years. She works 3 jobs to pay for her mother's cancer treatment. She stands up to bullies like Victoria. And yes, I paid her to pretend to love me, because I was too much of a coward to believe anyone could do it for real." Elena pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "But somewhere along the way," Alexander continued, his voice breaking slightly, "I stopped pretending, and I hope, she did too." Eleanor's expression had shifted from disappointment to something that looked almost like pride. "So where is she now?" the older woman demanded. Alexander's shoulders sagged. "Gone. I sent her away because I'm an idiot who destroys everything he touches." "Yes," said a clear, strong voice from the doorway. "You are." Every head in the ballroom turned as Elena stepped into the light, her chin raised, her dark eyes blazing with determination. "But you're not the only one with something to say." The ballroom fell silent as Elena stepped into the light, every eye fixed on her like she was a goddess descending from Mount Olympus. In her midnight blue dress, with her chin raised and fire in her dark eyes, she looked like she could conquer nations. Alexander's face went white, then red, emotions flashing across his features too quickly to catalog. Elena, what am I doing here? Elena's voice carried to every corner of the vast room, clear and strong. I'm here because your grandmother deserves the truth. All of it. She walked into the center of the ballroom, her heels clicking on the marble like a countdown to Judgment Day. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea, Victoria Pemberton's mouth hanging open in shock. Yes, Alexander paid me to be his girlfriend, Elena announced, her voice ringing with pride instead of shame. $100,000 to pretend to love a man who was convinced he was unlovable. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Elena raised her hand for silence. But here's what he didn't pay for. He didn't pay for me to see through his armor to the scared little boy underneath. He didn't pay for me to recognize the loneliness in his eyes or the way he flinched every time someone got too close. Elena's voice softened, her gaze finding Alexander's across the room. And he certainly didn't pay for me to fall in love with him anyway. Alexander stepped forward, his gray eyes wide with something that looked like hope. Elena, I'm not finished. Elena turned to face the crowd, her voice growing stronger. You want to judge me? Fine. Judge away. Yes, I clean offices for a living. Yes, I have a GED instead of a Harvard degree. Yes, I took money from a man because my mother is dying and I was desperate. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some looking ashamed of their earlier whispers. But I've never had to buy companionship, Elena continued, her eyes finding Victoria's shocked face. I've never torn others down to make myself feel important. And I've never been so empty inside that I needed to mock someone else's love to feel alive. Victoria's face went purple with rage. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Elena smiled, the expression sharp as a blade. Mrs. Pemberton, you've spent this entire week trying to humiliate me because you saw something in Alexander that terrified you. The possibility that someone could love him for who he really is, not what he owns. Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears, and something that looked suspiciously like pride. Go on, dear. Elena turned back to Alexander, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You want to know the real reason I'm here? Not for your money. I already deposited that check. Not for your grandmother, though I adore her. I'm here because 3 hours ago, my dying mother looked me in the eye and told me that money which costs your soul is no money at all. Alexander was moving toward her now, hope and anguish warring in his expression. I'm here, Elena continued, her voice breaking slightly, because I love you, Alexander Blackwood. Not your billions, not your empire, not your name. I love the man who defended my honor in front of these vultures. I love the man who showed me his childhood bedroom and trusted me with his pain. I love the man who's been running from love his entire life because he's terrified of losing it. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear a champagne bubble pop. But mostly, Elena said, tears streaming down her face, I'm here because I'm not going anywhere. You can fire me, dismiss me, break my heart into a million pieces, but you can't make me stop loving you. And if that terrifies you, then you're just going to have to be terrified. Alexander stopped directly in front of her, his hands trembling as he reached up to cup her face. Elena, Don't you dare apologize, Elena whispered fiercely. Don't you dare tell me this is for my own good or that I deserve better. I'm a grown woman and I choose you. Damaged, terrified, impossible you. Even though I'm broken? Alexander's voice was barely audible. Especially because you're broken. Elena smiled through her tears. Because so am I. And maybe, just maybe, our broken pieces fit together. Alexander's control finally shattered. God, Elena, I love you so much it terrifies me. I've loved you since you called me out in my office, but I didn't know how to... Elena silenced him with a kiss that made the crowd gasp, and Eleanor applaud. When they finally broke apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. Well, Eleanor said loudly, wiping her own eyes, it's about bloody time. The crowd erupted in applause, genuine this time, not the polite clapping of society events. Even some of the most cynical socialites were dabbing at their eyes. Victoria Pemberton, however, was having none of it. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked. "She's a gold digger, a nobody. This will never last." Alexander turned to face her, his arm firmly around Elena's waist. "You know what, Victoria? You're absolutely right about one thing: this will never last." Elena's heart plummeted, but Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger. "It won't last because what Elena and I have isn't some temporary arrangement. It's forever." He looked down at Elena, his eyes blazing with love and determination. "If she'll have me." Before Elena could respond, Alexander dropped to one knee, pulling a ring box from his jacket pocket. The crowd gasped, and Elena's hands flew to her mouth. "Elena Vasquez," Alexander said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "you've shown me what real courage looks like. You've taught me that love isn't a weakness. It's the only thing that makes us strong. Will you marry me? Will you take on this broken billionaire and teach him how to live?" Elena looked down at him, this powerful man kneeling before her in front of Seattle's entire elite, and knew her answer had never been in doubt. "Alexander Blackwood," she said, her voice ringing with joy, "I thought you'd never ask." The ring was perfect, simple, elegant, nothing like the gaudy displays of wealth these people usually favored. As Alexander slipped it onto her finger, Elena felt like she could fly. The ballroom erupted in chaos, applause, tears, and yes, even Victoria Pemberton storming out in a rage, her exit completely ignored by everyone else. Eleanor pushed through the crowd to embrace them both. "Welcome to the family, dear," she whispered to Elena. "You're exactly what this family needs." As the night wore on, Elena found herself laughing and dancing with a man who looked nothing like the cold billionaire she'd first met. This Alexander smiled freely, held her close, and looked at her like she'd hung the moon. "No regrets?" he asked as they swayed to the orchestra's final song. "Only one," Elena replied, grinning up at him. Alexander's face clouded with concern. "What?" "I should have asked for more money," Elena said with a perfectly straight face. "I severely underestimated my worth." Alexander threw back his head and laughed, a sound of pure joy that seemed to surprise him as much as everyone else. "Don't worry, Mrs. Blackwood-to-be," he said, spinning her around. "I plan to spend the rest of my life showing you exactly how priceless you are." As the last notes of the waltz faded away and Seattle's elite began to disperse, Alexander and Elena stood together in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the wreckage of walls that had taken decades to build and only 4 days to tear down. Outside, Victoria Pemberton sat in her car, furiously texting every gossip columnist in the city. But inside, Elena Vasquez, soon to be Elena Blackwood, danced with the love of her life and knew that sometimes the best fairy tales were the ones that started with a business proposition and ended with a choice. The choice to love, to trust, to believe that sometimes two broken people really could make each other whole. And as Alexander spun her around the empty ballroom, Elena laughed with pure joy, knowing that this was only the beginning of their story. After all, the best love stories weren't about perfection. They were about two people who chose each other, flaws and all, and never let go. The end.